Loot, pixels, upgrades, looks. It's at the forefront of any RPG in history. Everyone wants it, no one has enough, and people will lie, cheat, betray, and steal to get it. So naturally, it has to be treated very carefully, and in the case of MMOs, even more so, since you're now in direct competition with other people. It varies between games. In current, it's not that big of a deal because of personal loot. You run a raid, and you get loot, or you don't, and you have nothing but luck to blame. However, in Classic, it's more traditional. You kill a boss, it drops loot, and you dish it out. Don't be fooled by this veil of simplicity though. Behind this simple idea lies anger, jealousy, and betrayal. Something that players were not prepared for with the re-release was the loot and raiding, and in the game's short 7-month lifespan, many guilds have already fallen under the yoke of loot drama, and in this video, I wanted to talk about the 3 big ones and their strengths and weaknesses for any aspiring guild leaders out there, or even those of you just looking for a guild. Anarchy, a state of disorder due to the absence or non-recognition of authority. Lady Luck reigns supreme with the first on our list, and that's open roll. Well, not fully open. You'd have to be pretty naive to have open loot to 40 people and just trust everyone not to take whatever they wanted.
Oh my god! What the fuck? Oh my god.
No, it's more like the Helmet of Wrath drops, so all tanks roll on it, excluding DPS warriors until all of the tanks already have it. The pros would be there are no favorites nor discrimination. The only thing that's standing between you and the item is your own luck. It's fair, right? Well, yes, in that aspect it is. But what about this situation? You have a tank who's online every day, tanks dungeons for guildmates, even if he doesn't need them. He brings consumables, PvPs, he's always online in Discord. This is a valuable guild member who gets along with most people. And you have the other tank, whose playtime starts and ends with raid, and you question if there's some sort of weird government experiment because they never spoken a single word in voice chat. This person wins the Helmet of Wrath, and you don't see him for 6.5 days, and your active tank is still using this piece of crap. Anything is variable. You could apply bonuses to rolls depending on activity or the ability to speak, but how much? What's fair and what isn't? Is it to all rolls? This brings in micromanagement and authority to a loot system that people flock to because they don't like micromanagement and authority in their loot system. So, let's bring some order to all of this, shall we? We talked about adding bonuses to those who are more active within the guild. Maybe the more stuff they do, they get points. You get points for raids, of course, but maybe also for attending guild events, PvPing, or whatever. Well, it's not a very creative idea, because it's existed for around 20 years. First brought about in EverQuest, the DKP system was one of the ways to distribute loot in the original Classic. It was hard to find a guild that didn't use it, in fact. Basically, each boss in each raid gives you a certain amount of points. You kill Lucifron, and you and everyone else present gets 2 points, and you kill Nefarian, and you and everyone else present gets 6 points. This is the bare minimum the system is set up for. It varies guild by guild. Some give points for PvP, and some for even donating materials or gold to a guild bank. A derivation that's gaining in popularity is EPGP, where instead of DKP you have EP or effort points, and a second currency is added called gear points, which goes up as you get gear, and loot priority is decided on the quotient of these two numbers. A more detailed version of DKP essentially. But back to the base DKP system here, you then spend these points on the actual items. There are a couple of different ways in doing this as well. One is an auction style, where you choose how many points you spend. So player A bids 5 points on an item, then player B chimes in with 10, and so on and so forth until the highest bidder wins. And you also have the second variant, where items have a set point value, and the person with the highest point total wins it, and then gets that price deducted from their total. So, going back to that Helmet of Wrath scenario, this time it would go to the active tank, assuming that he has the most points. The other tank would eventually get his, of course, but as appropriate to his activity within the guild, it would be much later. The pro of this method is that you get what you put in. If you're an active member, you're thusly rewarded with more gear more quickly, and it'll get more use since you don't log out for 6 days immediately after raid. There are cons though. Like I said, it was hard to find a guild back then that didn't use it, but today it's not as prolific. But why is this? Well, first is with the variant A, where people can enter a bidding war, it's extremely susceptible to collusion. Let's say you have 3 tanks. Tanks A and B are real good friends, but they hate Tank C. So Tank B makes an agreement with A that if Tank C doesn't bid, just bid 1 point and I'll pass it to you. Otherwise, let's bid up that C a-hole. So this allows tanks A and B to stay at the top indefinitely because they get items for 1 point, and whenever C wants something, they bid him or her up to expensive prices. And even the set point system has issues. I can relate to this one perfectly, as it happened in my guild back in 2005. We had 2 rogues, A and B. A was a newish rogue, but a nice dude who tried hard. We were in AQ40, and the rogues in our guild were always pretty tight-knit when it came to gear, and we would sort of convene and try to get the biggest upgrades possible for the lower geared rogues for the betterment of the guild. Everyone was like-minded and on the same page here, except for Rogue B, who happened to be our raid leader in fact. The item in this particular example was the ancient Kiraji Ripper. Rogue B we referred to as the weapon collector, because that's what he did. He liked to collect weapons, even if he didn't use them, something that the DKP system we had allowed. For example, he'd have chromatically tempered sword, and he'd outbid someone on brutality blade, then throw it in his bank, and let it collect dust because he liked to look at it, I guess. Like I said, Rogue A was fairly new to the guild, and he was coming in with Dalaran set or some pre-raid blue, and he was lower in DKP, but since he always tried and he was a cool dude in general, the rogues agreed to pass on the sword because it was a huge upgrade for him naturally. So Rogue B at the time had the chromatically tempered sword, I'm fairly sure, so also an upgrade for him, but minor in comparison, and when the sword dropped, he bid on it, locking Rogue A out, and then another rogue in turn outbid him, and then he got pissed, he G-quit, and the rest is history. The whole thing was pretty petty, but that's loot in a nutshell in Classic. It's all petty. There is also a pay-to-win aspect if you give out points for donating gold or consumables. It depends on the guild, some set a limit to it, but still, some people can take issue with this. It's also a logistical nightmare. I was good friends with the guy who did the DKP for a guild, and he would be up at night trying to settle disputes. Like I was here for the first 2 bosses, and then I left, and I came back for the last 2, or, oh, this guy was AFK for this fight, so you should deduct points. So, the point system is exploitable, and it does have flaws. The last group of players here though, just say F it. No rolling, no points, we decide where the loot goes. I'm of course talking about loot council here, where a group of people, typically officers, get together and vote on who gets what. The pros and cons in this should be pretty self-explanatory. If run well, the loot is handed out in such a way that it benefits the guild the most. And if run poorly, corruption and personal grudges dictate who gets what. We all know the story of the loot council, whose itinerary is to gear themselves first, and then the rest of the rabble later on. It's a hard thing to describe because it's so subjective. Something that seems grossly unfair from the outside may be perfectly reasonable on the inside, or vice versa. It really just depends if you have honest people truly making the best decision for what's good for the guild, and when you bring in human nature into the equation, anything can happen. I think the one concrete thing you can say is that it's the most susceptible to drama. Free-for-all can be frustrating, but ultimately, it's your role against theirs. DKP can be manipulated, but it's inevitable that you'll get something. With Loot Council, it's possible you'll get nothing for 2 months. You don't get loot because you don't perform well, and you don't perform well because you don't get loot. Plus, I just think that the idea of someone else dictating what you deserve and what you don't deserve just rubs people the wrong way. It's like, if you're a good boy, you get a treat. If you ask me, they all have their ups and downs. I think in general, for me, DKP is the most appealing. The thing I like about DKP is that eventually you're gonna get something. Eventually, no matter what, you're rewarded for the amount of time that you put in. The downside of Loot Council, I think, is that oftentimes it's disproportionate. Not always, but oftentimes there's just 1 or 2 people of a class who get fully decked out before others, And I'm not talking about what's fair here and what isn't. What I'm talking about, and I see it all the time, is that the faster a player is geared out, the more likely they are to quit. Classic is a simple game. For endgame, you have raiding and PvP, with loot of course serving as the carrot on a stick. If you remove the carrot on a stick by fully gearing out one player, you remove their main reason to play. Yes, ideally, you gear out the players who raid more for the sake of raiding, and just hang out with friends and helping the guild, but humans are not infallible. The faster you gear someone out, the more likely that person will end up quitting because they have less reason to show up. I feel like loot console guilds have a harder fight against attrition way more than DKP or rolling guilds, because they get in the cycle of feeding one person all this loot, and then removing a big reason for them to play. They quit, then go to the next person, and rinse and repeat. It's putting all of your eggs into one basket, which is really risky. I think with DKP or free roll, the biggest advantage they have is that loot in general is spread around more. Therefore, you have an easier time keeping an active roster. I think to the more casual player, these two systems are the most appealing, and to those who care more about progression, they will go down the more risky loot console route. It can be done well. I'm actually in a loot console guild as I make this video, and I haven't had any troubles personally. The bottom line is that there's no system where everyone will be happy. Loot really does make people crazy in this game. Someone, in some way, will always feel like they've been wronged somehow, and that item should be theirs, this is bullcorn, and I'm joining this other guild where the exact same thing will happen. Hopefully this video didn't give off the impression that the leadership is always in the wrong. The members can be just as bad, if not worse, trust me. I think people vastly underestimated personal loot and how it virtually eliminated all of this drama. The items do mean more in Classic due to competition. I'd just like to bring up that I remembered this specific item from 15 years ago that our guild had drama over, and I can't even remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. If that doesn't tell you how much more important loot is, I don't know what will, but it's definitely at a cost. If it were me, I would just go with the bouquet method. At weddings, the bride turns around and throws a bouquet over her head, and whoever catches it is destined for love. I would do that with each piece of loot, and watch people tear each other apart, and see who can come out with all their digits intact. So, the best you can do as a guild leader is to try your best to be fair with whatever system you decide. And the best you can do as a member is try your best to find a system that's right for you, and understand that sometimes that's the way the cookie crumbles, and that each boss drops 2 or 3 pieces of loot for 40 people. With the re-release of Classic, many things have changed. Bosses have become easier, the meta is more established. The only thing that hasn't changed is that loot makes people really angry.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.